Hi, Joe Ruhl here. I want to welcome you to this Science Musings video entitled Incredible Indigenous Invertebrates. If you're a high school biology teacher, I'm excited to share some teaching tips and ideas with you. And if you're not a high school biology teacher, but you're a lifelong learner, I think you'll enjoy this video on incredible indigenous invertebrates. Even though I'm retired from the biology classroom, I still love to read and dabble in the fascinating world of biology. So a few days ago, I went out and collected some pond water and studied it underneath the dissecting microscope. I have a dissecting microscope, and then I also have this little small digital camera that can be mounted onto the eyepiece of the microscope, so I can video the creatures that I might find underneath the microscope, living things that are ordinarily invisible to the naked eye. And if you look, for example, at this petri dish in this picture right here, you can see it's got pond water in it, and it just kind of looks like clear water because the little tiny creatures that live in it are almost invisible to the naked eye. If you've got really good eyesight, you might be able to see some tiny little specks flitting around in the water. But if you put it underneath a dissecting microscope, a whole new world of living things just explodes into view. So this was kind of fun to do. I just did it a few days ago and made some videos. And what showed up underneath the microscope, for example, were things like these guys, little clams. And everybody's favorite here, leeches. And there are even some black worms in that pond water. And you can also find little guys called ostracods. And these little creatures called scuds. And I remember one time in a high school biology classroom, a student of mine said, "Mr. Ruhl, that looks like a shrimp." And I said, "Why do you suppose that is? Why do you think it looks like a shrimp?" Got some family resemblances going on here. And of course it looks like a shrimp because it's closely related to shrimp. And I could also see some of these little guys called water mites. Some people are not too excited about these, but they're interesting to look at. And the thing that we need to realize about these little creatures that you can see in pond water under a dissecting microscope, like I did just a few days ago, is these are invertebrate animals, animals that do not have a backbone. And what's interesting about invertebrates is that, we humans like to think we're all that, but 95% of all the species of all the animals on the planet are invertebrates, and many of them are invisible with the naked eye, like these guys in this picture right here. But I think probably my favorite invertebrates, pond water invertebrates, would be these guys. They're called Daphnia, and they're very small, of course. They're transparent, and you can actually see the internal organs inside of their bodies. Now, a lot of people commonly call these water fleas, but that's really kind of a misnomer because they're not insects like fleas are. They're not in the insect class. They're crustaceans, which means that they're actually more closely related to things like shrimp that you can see in this picture right here, and crabs, like these crabs right here, and lobsters and crayfish. Lobsters, like this lobster right here being enjoyed by this human at dinner time. So they're crustaceans. And the neat thing about Daphnia is you can grab these little guys if you're very patient. I had to be really patient. I had this little tiny little pipette, or an eyedropper if you want to call it that. I was able, with some patience, to isolate one little Daphnia out of this petri dish of pond water as I was looking at it underneath the dissecting microscope. isolate one little Daphnia and put it on a microscope slide, and then put that underneath a different kind of a microscope called a compound microscope, which magnifies even more. And this is what I was able to then see. Here's this little Daphnia that I caught with the video camera. And there he was, or she, just sitting still there. And you can see they're very complex. When you magnify them, you see they're really complex. This little Daphnia right here, made up of tens of thousands of cells and internal organs that you can see because they're transparent. And for example, they have look at this, they've got a compound eye, which is a complex structure in itself. And you can see it kind of rotates as they're able to direct it towards light, different angles of light, so they can move around and either avoid the light or head towards the light. And they also have a little heart that you can see that beats like 200 times a minute. And then you can also a lot of times see their intestine right here. And you can see food actually going through that intestine if you watch long enough. So these little microscopic invertebrates, they're just flat out cool. And you know, looking at these creatures under the microscope just a few days ago reminded me of a fun moment of serendipitous joy that occurred in my classroom when I was teaching high school 9th grade biology students just a few years ago. And you see, what happened was I learned in this activity that a lot of times engaging students in out of the ordinary kinds of learning experiences can create unexpected, positive, fun responses from the students. I call them serendipitous moments of joy. And I'd like to just share one of those that occurred. And it was several years ago. And I remember I took a chance. I said to myself, okay, rather than start out early in the first week of school with mundane rules, policies, procedure, let's just jump right into biology. So the weekend before, I had gone out and collected these buckets of pond water. And I've learned how to concentrate the little invertebrate animals in these buckets of pond water. I've learned how to concentrate them so that the population density in the petri dishes is a lot higher than it is out in the wild, so that when the kids put their petri dish of pond water under the microscope, they can't miss these little creatures swimming and cavorting and flitting around underneath their very noses. And so it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. And what was really interesting was the kids really got into it. It was amazing. 25 ninth graders perfectly behaved because they were so into it. And they just really enjoyed the activity. See, what I told them at the beginning of that class was, okay, I've put some buckets of pond water on this lab table over here, along with some high-tech fancy equipment like turkey basters and little pipettes, if you want to call them eyedroppers, that's okay, and petri dishes. And what I want you to do is find 2 lab partners to work with. And you and your 2 lab partners go to one of the lab tables where you'll find a dissecting microscope already set up. And then go with a turkey baster, suck up some of the pond water from one of the buckets and squirt it into your petri dish. And then just place your petri dish underneath your dissecting microscope. Now, I've given you some pond water identification guides so that you can identify the creatures that you find. And here's what I want you to do. This is what I told the kids. I want you to find 4 creatures under your microscope that you've never seen before and draw them. And then look up in the pond water guide pictures that match what you see under the microscope so you can identify and label your diagrams with the proper scientific name or common name of the creatures that you find. Find 4 of them. Creatures that you've never seen before, and I guarantee you the kids had never seen these before, and that made it lots of fun. Some of them thought they looked like aliens from some other planet because they had never seen them before. And so it was so much fun to hear their joyous expressions of discovery. For example, when one little guy grabbed his partner's arm and said, "Look at this under here. You've got to see this. This is so cool." Heard lots of comments like that. A lot of questions. I learned that day, or relearned, I might say, that in a student-centered environment like that, you can generate in the kids a need to know. They're going to see things. They're going to start asking questions, and they'll generate the questions. And then you can teach off of their questions as you're roaming around the classroom. And there's magic that happens in a student-centered environment like that. And it was a lot of fun. Now, a couple of the kids, though, initially said, "Ooh, Mr. Ruhl, these are gross. This is gross. They're so gross." And I said, whoa, wait a minute. They're not gross. They're made up of the same kinds of atoms and molecules that your body's made of. And I'll tell you why. Well, there are a lot of reasons why, but one reason why is because you have directly, if you've ever been swimming in a lake and you've accidentally swallowed a mouthful of water, then you have directly eaten some of these little critters. Accidentally, directly eaten them. And when you do that, the atoms and the molecules that make up their bodies become incorporated and become part of your body. Now, you've also eaten them indirectly. Even if you've never been swimming in a lake and accidentally swallowed a mouthful of water, you've eaten them indirectly, especially if you've ever eaten freshwater fish. Because, for example, take these Daphnia, for example. They and other microscopic invertebrates are eaten by tiny little fish. And the atoms and molecules that make up these little invertebrates become incorporated into the tiny little fish's body. And then these tiny little fish are eaten by slightly bigger fish, which in turn are eaten by even bigger fish, which in turn are eaten by bigger fish, which then are eaten by really big fish, which might then be eaten by humongous fish like this. And then you or any other human could come along and eat that fish. And in so doing, you incorporate the atoms and molecules that were part of the bodies of every creature along that chain. And we call this a food chain. There are lots of different kinds of food chains and food webs in the natural world. And I told the kids, and we're going to be learning about these in more detail as the school year goes on. If you've ever eaten seafood at a seafood restaurant, then you have participated in those vast ocean food chains. And incidentally, a lot of the links in our ocean's food chains are endangered right now due to increased ocean warming caused by climate change. Hopefully, we, if not we, then our descendants may figure out how to be wise enough to offset this dangerous trend. Because we all know what happens to a chain if you destroy even just one link in that chain. So it's important to learn about. But anyway, kids really got into this activity, and one of the best moments of serendipitous joy occurred when a young lady raised her hand and she yelled from across the room, "Mr. Ruhl, quick, come here, you have got to see this." So I went over to her microscope. She had isolated with a tiny little micropipette. She had isolated one little Daphnia. And she was looking at it underneath the compound microscope, because I had some of these microscopes set up as well. And she said, "Mr. Ruhl, this Daphne is having babies. And I looked through the microscope, and sure enough, remember their bodies are transparent, you could see inside of her body little miniature mini-me versions of her, babies that had hatched out inside of her body. That's what happens. They hatch out, they hatch from eggs inside the mother's body. And then after they hatch out, then they come out of the mother's body. It looks like she's giving birth. And there they were, popping out one by one. It was a moment. And you know, all of a sudden, all the other kids start lining up behind this one microscope. They all wanted to look, because this was not something that they were all seeing under their own individual microscopes. And they were enthralled. It was awesome. They all broke into this loud chorus of happy birthday, singing happy birthday to these Daphnia. Now, that was an enjoyable moment. And I'll tell you, this guided inquiry lesson was really designed to do three things. Number one, first, to introduce the kids to the concept of biodiversity, because we started out the school year on the topic of ecology. I wanted them to learn about how vast the diversity of living things in the natural world is. I wanted them to see that most of the important links in food chains we can't even see with the naked eye. So I wanted them to be introduced to the concept of biodiversity. And the second purpose of the activity was for them to discover how to use the microscope. Actually discover it. And I guess I learned that from my dad when I was a little kid. I remember when he was teaching me how to ride a bike. He didn't project up on the screen a diagram of a bicycle with all the parts and have me learn all the parts of the bicycle and their functions. No, he didn't do it that way. He said, here, hop on this bike, see if you can ride it. And after a few bumps and bruises and scrapes, I kind of got the hang of it after a while. But so I wanted them to discover how to use the microscope. And I was there by their side to help them. And then the third, perhaps the most important reason for doing the activity was I wanted to whet their appetites and show them just how cool biology really is, so that when they came back the next day and we started going over rules and regulations and policies, they would have already bought in to biology class. You know, that day at the beginning of the school year taught me that magic can happen in the classroom if we remove ourselves from front and center, strive to try to establish a student-centered environment. If we surprise them with an experience that creates in them a need to know, then they'll start asking the questions, and that's when real learning can happen. That's when the magic can happen. So thanks for joining me in this Science Musings video. It's been fun for me, and I encourage you to watch Disney's The Lion King again. Watch that again and listen to the voice of Mufasa, played by the late, great James Earl Jones, as he explains so eloquently what food chains are all about. So have a great day, and remember, you are what you eat.